Now, what did Ike mean when he issued his valedictory in January 1961? I think it's okay to focus on his comments that are clearly prescient regarding the power, the undue power and influence of what he called, or Bryce Harlow, his assistant speechwriter, was allegedly responsible for coining the phrase, the military-industrial complex. So that's, and it's also pretty clear to any historian of the Eisenhower administration or of his career how he came to that kind of an approach and why he said what he said. Career military man, also president during some of the hottest war times of the Cold War. And I think we can take at face value, clearly, many of his statements about warning us about over-militarizing our society, getting entangled in wars that, in a sense, rob not only our children, but all of our people of their humanity and a decent life. So I have no quibble with that. But I also, having studied Ike's economic policy tooth and nail, understand what he really meant, I think, by this address. And I think the speech was largely focused on the peril of deficits and debt, something very much in mind today. Eisenhower, his approach to fiscal policy seldom veered from a preoccupation with this. And what I'll show you in a bit, I have a chart on the second or third slide, is that in many respects he followed through. Eisenhower delivered on his pledge and ongoing promise to his party, to his country, to be parsimonious, to squeeze the budget, to not leave us with deficits and a large overhang of debt, as he would describe it. I would also suggest that this preoccupation with deficits and debt reflected in part his shift in thinking on national security, on the military. He called it the New Look strategy. And essentially, at its core, was an attempt to trim expenses. He was convinced, for a number of reasons, which I won't go into today, that you could do two things that were somewhat different from what we had done in the 1940s that would save a lot of money. The first would be an accent on covert action, as opposed to conventional warfare and troops, which he viewed as a very expensive undertaking. He was convinced, and I think sadly convinced with limited evidence, and this is something, an area in which I don't think he was very prescient at all, but he was convinced that using an intelligence agency's covert action would save us a lot of money and would blow up in our face. He was looking at the alleged successes in Iran, Guatemala, the latest administration in the Congo, and he was really fascinated in some ways with the leverage that these kinds of interventions presented to him, and also, I wouldn't say excited, but very much interested in the ways in which they appeared to save a lot of money. And we know today about the growth of that vestige of our national security state that really didn't quite turn out that way. This is, some of the most expensive things we do today involve intelligence agencies. And perhaps somebody at the conference will flesh that out in greater detail later on. The second plank of his New Look strategy was reliance on nuclear deterrence, that is, stockpile atomic bombs, and with the threat of the atomic bombs, perhaps you wouldn't have to use troops as readily and as often. Just brandish these weapons, stockpile them again and again and again. LBJ, a few years later, would refer to this as a WPA for atomic bombs. And he would speak of that pejoratively, saying, I don't want a WPA for atomic bombs. It's time to start spending something on grandma instead of this. But Ike was clearly taken with this idea that if you build up this massive arsenal, that you can avoid war, that you can avoid expensive invasions and troop movements and Clearly, he's colored by his experience in World War II, where, there's one banquet that I always recall where Stalin and Churchill were toasting the American intervention late in the war. And I think it was Stalin who toasted and said, this is a war of engines and octanes. Here's to the American petroleum industry. And, so I think felt that. That's what made it so expensive, just moving men and material, massive movements around the globe. And that's something he hoped to avoid. He thought atomic bombs and covert action could do it for him. I think with that preoccupation and this kind of a shift, focusing as he did in the speech on the perils of the deficit and debt, that he missed the real economic peril of reliance on military spending and on an enlarged military-industrial complex. And I'll flesh that out a little bit later. Now, I did say that he followed through with his pledge to cut the budget, and this includes the entire budget, not just the military budget, but if you focus just on military spending during the Eisenhower years, here's essentially what happened. From about $526 billion, and this is in 2012 dollars, to about $382 billion at the end of his administration. So he did cut it considerably. Now, the reason I say that his concern is a little bit misplaced is because one of the other things we forget about the 1950s, I think partly because, there's a number of things going on here. I was fascinated with the idea and very much interested in the idea of creating an interstate highway system and a transportation network, partly from his experience in World War I, where it was difficult to move troops from one side of the country to the other. He actually went on a caravan in 1917, I think it was, in which he kind of discovered some of the pitfalls of our transportation network. Early on, there was a slim Republican majority, but it gave way quickly to a slim Democratic majority in the middle 50s and late 50s. And they fought like tooth and nail over overall spending and pushed him a little bit more in the direction of spending more on a couple of programs in particular, Social Security and housing. We have clearly a leftover, which Ike partly embraced, of the New Deal state and the social safety net. So that we have what we call automatic stabilizers in that regard. That is, when the economy goes down, some of these programs kick in, automatically spending more money, lifting the economy, helping people. We end up spending a little bit more money automatically as a result of that. All those things taken into account, however, Ike did reduce budgets, dramatically reduce deficits, so that in fact he produced surpluses in a few years. And what I've got here, I think, they're all on the chart. At first it bled over on the end. But here's what happens when you do that. And this is why deficit spending, and I'll flesh it out a little bit, and why it's so important. But maybe an easy way to conceive of this is if you're running a surplus, essentially what you're doing is the government is taking more money out of the economy than it's putting back in. And it's such a powerful influence over the direction of the economy that virtually every time we've done this in the 20th century, it's been followed by recession. And there's no exception in the 1950s. Take a look at this chart. You can see that the Eisenhower surpluses came in 56, 57, and then again in 1960s. In both cases, followed directly by recessions. Richard Nixon, running against John Kennedy in 1960, blamed the recession in 1960 and 61 for his defeat, his narrow defeat against John Kennedy. And of course, there's lots of things going on here. There's the famous televised debates, there's the blue bomb letter that the Kennedy family sent to Coretta Scott King, signifying implicit support of his civil rights movement, and lots of things are happening here. But clearly, the direction of the economy was a big part of it. And Eisenhower leaves us at the time he's making his valedictory address with a pretty deep recession. The earlier one in 56 was not as as deep. Ironically, this one, I think, in my mind, always signifies how public policy can be good or bad, and it's very important, and it will move economies always, and maybe more important than anything else on the margin. But what happens in the private sector sort of matters too. And one of the things that softened the blow in 56 and 57 was that the big three automakers had a banner year. They were producing cars that people simply loved, and so they bought them whether they could afford them or not, and kind of extended themselves a little bit. Now, what are the Keynesian levers that I think we ought to focus on when we're putting military spending in the context of a Keynesian approach to an economy? Often forgotten, but first and foremost in Keynes's general theory is the notion that governments have the ability and should adhere to a regime of low long-term interest rates. Today we pretend that the bond market dictates this for us, for long-term interest rates. The Federal Reserve will tell you that they can control short-term interest rates, and there's a preoccupation with the money supply versus the price of money. But Keynes always argued that the price of money was the key. And the key there was to have a low threshold for investment, which meant a low interest rate. If you didn't have that, you were going to bog down capitalist economies no matter what. So that's at the core of the general theory. Below that, in place of secondary influence, is when things move away from full employment for a number of reasons that are often beyond the control of an interest rate regime, which can keep things close, but you're always going to have oscillations. But when things move a little bit away from full employment and economic opportunity, you must engage in compensatory fiscal policy. This is where deficit spending comes in. And generally, this has been misconstrued too. The way that the crude Keynesian formula is generally spelled out in most economics classes is that, if things are going badly, you need deficit spending. If they're going well, you need surpluses. So it's kind of a balance beam type effect. In effect, what this overlooks is Keynes' very marked description of how a capitalist economy generates on its own, left to its own devices, so much inequality that you almost always need some deficit spending to counteract that. Almost always. There's going to be very few instances where you can accept balance or a slight surplus. And the way I always describe it, especially given the track record of what happens when you run surpluses, generally for over 6 quarters. If it's 2 quarters or a year, and it's a temporary surplus, and you move quickly, whether it's because of automatic stabilizers or a new ARA bill or stimulus spending of some sort, generally you can avoid problems. But anything over that, you're going to generally create a recessionary environment. So the simple lesson here is that deficit spending is an important part of the toolkit and almost always has to be. And that only when you reach the apex of a full employment kind of cycle can you countenance a temporary balance or surplus. But you should not sit there at that point generally. Because again, a capitalist economy left to its own devices, even with these automatic stabilizers and so forth, creates so much inequality on its own. You need this, you have to do this. And that leads me to the third component here, which is how that works. And it's, one of the faults, I think, of Keynes's writing was that he assumed, writing in 1936, that progressive tax policy had made its mark and would be with us for all time because it was such a sound way to finance governments everywhere that he didn't really have to spell it out. It was a given. That you're going to have a progressive tax system and it's going to do this work for you. And so he could focus then on how big of a deficit you needed to make that redistribution do its work. But at the bottom and the base of all this is a presumption that it is going to do that work. Now, we're in an age where we're living after about 30 years of hearing the tax cut mantra over and over and over again, and most of us know about what that's done and how it hasn't paid off in large measure. But the federal tax code still remains progressive. And so it still makes its mark in this way, and so deficit spending can do what Keynes claimed it could do. And of course, if you screw up interest rate regime while you're doing that, then because that's the most powerful influence, then it can set you back anyway. And what that would imply is you have to do more deficit spending or more risk redistribution, one or the other. But these are the levers, and I put them in an inverted pyramid because the one at the top is clearly central and the most powerful, and the redistributive fiscal policy is at the bottom. Not because it's necessarily the least powerful, but partly because it's a given, and that we assume that it's always going to be there. I think it's proper, if you're talking about government influence, not just to focus on the federal government, so that if you factor in local, state, and federal taxation, and you look at it as a whole, we've come to a point in our history where it's largely flat. Because the state and local regimes are regressive, they're upside down, they tax poor people more heavily than they tax the wealthy, and it's pretty much a straight line regression. And the federal government still, despite some regressive elements as the payroll tax and a lot of excises that have grown out over the years, it's still a little bit progressive, and it offsets the other. So we don't use the power of redistributive fiscal policy as we could if we had simply held on to the regime that Keynes saw in 1936 when he wrote. That was slowly emerging around the world. Now, the United States really didn't get a broad progressive income tax until 1942, so a little bit after that. But he saw it coming, because everybody was moving in that direction.
Can you please explain again why the low interest rates process, why he felt that was so critical?
Sure. Well, one of the broad misunderstandings of Keynes, I'm sorry, you couldn't hear the question. She asked, explain again why the low long-term interest rate component of the Keynesian approach is so critical.
Why he felt it.
And why he felt it and why I think it's critical. I agree with you. What we're generally dealing with whenever Keynes makes it into the newspapers is what Joan Robinson called bastardized Keynesianism. And usually it's just simply described as deficit spending and nothing more. Well, if you read the book, what you'll see is that critical to his thinking about, and he was out to save capitalism. He liked capitalism. He understood it to be a mixed economy, so he wasn't he was under no illusions that it could ever function as a laissez-faire, free market type economy. But in its mixed variant, where you had active government intervention and active government structuring of the macro economy, he thought it could work. And so in a sense, Keynes was writing as a response to socialists and communists of the era who thought that it couldn't work. Now, key to that recipe was investment. And he thought that investors were so fickle, so ignorant, so prone to the follies of human psychology that they couldn't be entrusted with doing the job themselves. That's really what it comes down to. And what he saw was that what made them leap more than anything else was robust demand, aggregate demand. That is, citizens, a broad array of citizens with money in their pocket to purchase goods and services in their shops. What kept them from meeting that demand in certain circumstances was this preoccupation with inflation and with the idea that too much demand would somehow give you this inflationary bubble and would destabilize everything, and that the way you treated that was you raised interest rates, essentially throwing people out of work to make sure that things didn't heat up too quickly, too fast. He thought that was utter nonsense, and he showed in his book many ways in which the low interest rate regime, the high demand, the high pressure demand, as one of his followers called it later, was actually good for stability and economies of scale and all kinds of things like that. But what it's about is really a threshold for investment. So that if interest rates are high, and an investor comes up and say, well, yeah, there's people who want my goods and services, and I'd like to expand the factory, I'd like to sell more widgets, whatever the case may be, but to expand, I've got to borrow money. And if I've got to borrow at 10%, and I predict that I'll be able to make a profit margin of 7%, then why the hell am I going to do it? I'll lose 3%. So he saw that as critical. Now, it's not that capitalists themselves didn't like that idea or see that fairly clearly, up front themselves, but they bought so heavily into this bogey of inflation that it had to be, stabilized. And you've got a lot of financiers, of course, calling the shots in the world economy, who aren't making things; they're just loaning money, And so they like high interest rates too. So there's a lot of rationalizations for why you would want high interest rates. And I think the most preeminent one that we're left with today is this mistaken belief that governments have no control over. And Keynes saw that that was pure bunk, that if you wanted to, you could issue debt in such a manner, various types of issues, that is short-term versus long-term, and he called it a tap issue, that is, whatever the economy demanded, you would issue. You wouldn't limit it, the sale of this kind of debt. And indeed, that's what happens with debt and money supply, which is why the preoccupation with the amount of money is pretty stupid. A capitalist economy will get the money it demands. If it's performing at a low level, it's not going to demand much. If it's performing at a high level, it will demand a lot. The key is the price, and that's what he's on.
I'm sorry, I'm really stuck on a concept about the redistribution of wealth as a given. Do you have to let me know that? Because I get rotten tomatoes when I just try to do it with my fellow citizens. I'm completely put down with it, Jack, but I don't know how to make it.
The first phrase I didn't catch your first phrase.
You said the redistribution of wealth as a given, not what I heard from.
Oh, I see. Well, it's not a given with the economy itself. It's a given with our government fiscal policy. Now, it's not as robust as it used to be, which I'm isolating as a problem. I mean, that's part of the problem here.
So I'd love to walk away with just a footnote on what do I throw back?
Yeah.
How do I substantiate that?
Well, the best, I don't know if you're talking about substantiating in terms of how doing that affects the economy or how that exists. Which are the two are you looking at?
How do I back up that concept? I believe in it, but I don't have.
That it works or not? Yeah. Well, it works. This has been under attack too, and if you look at the literature, and it's worth reading carefully, even though it's very poorly written. But it's all about what Keynes called the consumption function. And his simple consumption function idea was this, that as your wealth increases, so does your spending, but not by as much. Which means the wealthy save more, the poor spend more as a percentage of their income. Now, that's how it works. So that if you are redistributing the wealth or income of a nation, of an economy, and your tax system does it in such a way where it's fairly robust, then what you're doing simply is you're putting more money into the hands of people who are going to spend it all. And you're taking a little bit more money from people who tend to save a little bit more of it. That increases economic activity.